Chapter 25, Section 5, Part D of Capital, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Capital, a critical analysis of capitalist production, Volume 1, by Karl Marx. Translated from the third German edition by Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling, and edited by Friedrich Engels. Part 7. The Accumulation of Capital. Chapter 25. The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. Section 5. Illustrations of the General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. Part D. Effect of crisis on the best paid part of the working class. Before I turn to the regular agricultural laborers, I may be allowed to show by one example how industrial revulsions affect even the best paid, the aristocracy of the working class. It will be remembered that the year 1857 brought one of the great crises with which the industrial cycle periodically ends. The next termination of the cycle was due in 1866. Already discounted in the regular factory districts by the cotton famine, which threw much capital from its wanted sphere into the great centers of the money market, the crisis assumed at this time an especial financial character. Its outbreak in 1866 was signalized by the failure of a gigantic London bank, immediately followed by the collapse of countless swindling companies. One of the great London branches of industry involved in the catastrophe was iron shipbuilding. The magnates of this trade had not only overproduced beyond all measure during the overtrading time, but they had, besides, engaged in enormous contracts on the speculation that credit would be forthcoming to an equivalent extent. Now a terrible reaction set in that even at this hour, the end of March 1867, continues in this and other London industries. Footnote: "Wholesale starvation of the London poor. Within the last few days the walls of London have been placarded with large posters bearing the following remarkable announcement: Fat oxen, starving men. The fat oxen from their palace of glass have gone to feed the rich in their luxurious abode, while the starving men are left to rot and die in their wretched dens." The placards bearing these ominous words are put up at certain intervals. No sooner has one set been defaced or covered over, than a fresh set is placarded in a former or some equally public place. This reminds one of the secret revolutionary associations which prepared the French people for the events of 1789. At this moment, while English workmen, with their wives and children, are dying of cold and hunger, there are millions of English gold, the produce of English labor, being invested in Russian, Spanish, Italian, and other foreign enterprises. Reynolds Newspaper, January 20th, 1867. To show the condition of the laborers, I quote the following from the circumstantial report of a correspondent of the Morning Star, who, at the end of 1866 and beginning of 1867, visited the chief centers of distress. "In the East End districts of Poplar, Millwall, Greenwich, Deptford, Limehouse, and Canning Town, at least 15,000 workmen and their families were in a state of utter destitution, and 3,000 skilled mechanics were breaking stones in the workhouse yard, after distress of over half a year's duration. I had great difficulty in reaching the workhouse door, for a hungry crowd besieged it. They were waiting for their tickets, but the time had not yet arrived for the distribution. The yard was a great square place with an open shed running all round it, and several large heaps of snow covered the paving stones in the middle. In the middle also were little wicker fenced spaces, like sheep pens, where in fine weather the men worked, but on the day of my visit the pens were so snowed up that nobody could sit in them. Men were busy, however, in the open shed, breaking paving stones into macadam. Each man had a big paving stone for a seed, and he chipped away at the rime covered granite with a big hammer until he had broken up, and think, 5 bushels of it, and then he had done his day's work and got his day's pay, threepence, and an allowance of food. In another part of the yard was a rickety little wooden house, and when we opened the door of it, we found it filled with men who were huddled together shoulder to shoulder for the warmth of one another's bodies and breath. They were picking oakum, and disputing the while as to which could work the longest on a given quantity of food, for endurance was the point of honour. 7,000 in this one workhouse were recipients of relief; many hundreds of them, it appeared, were 6 or 8 months ago earning the highest wages paid to artisans. Their number would be more than doubled by the count of those who, having exhausted all their savings, still refuse to apply to the parish because they have a little left to pawn. Leaving the workhouse, I took a walk through the streets, mostly of little one-story houses, that abound in the neighbourhood of Poplar. My guide was a member of the Committee of the Unemployed. My first call was on an iron worker who had been 27 weeks out of employment. I found the man with his family sitting in a little back room. The room was not bare of furniture, and there was a fire in it. This was necessary to keep the naked feet of the young children from getting frostbitten, for it was a bitterly cold day. On a tray in front of the fire lay a quantity of oakum, which the wife and children were picking in return for their allowance from the parish. The man worked in the stone yard of the workhouse for a certain ration of food, and 3d. per day. He had now come home to dinner, quite hungry, as he told us with a melancholy smile, and his dinner consisted of a couple of slices of bread and dripping and a cup of milkless tea. The next door at which we knocked was opened by a middle-aged woman, who, without saying a word, led us into a little back parlour, in which sat all her family, silent and fixedly staring at a rapidly dying fire. Such desolation, such hopelessness was about these people and their little room, as I should not care to witness again. "Nothing have they done, sir," said the woman, pointing to her boys, "for 26 weeks, and all our money gone. All the £20 that me and father saved when times were better, thinking it would yield a little to keep us when we got past work. Look at it," she said, almost fiercely, bringing out a bank book with all its well-kept entries of money paid in and money taken out, so that we could see how the little fortune had begun with the first 5-shilling deposit, and had grown by little and little to be £20, and how it had melted down again, till the sum in hand got from pounds to shillings, and the last entry made the book as worthless as a blank sheet. This family received relief from the workhouse, and it furnished them with just one scanty meal per day. Our next visit was to an iron labourer's wife, whose husband had worked in the yards. We found her ill from want of food, lying on a mattress in her clothes, and just covered with a strip of carpet, for all the bedding had been pawned. 2 wretched children were tending her, themselves looking as much in need of nursing as their mother. 19 weeks of enforced idleness had brought them to this pass, and while the mother told the history of that bitter past, she moaned as if all her faith in a future that should atone for it were dead. On getting outside, a young fellow came running after us, and asked us to step inside his house and see if anything could be done for him. A young wife, 2 pretty children, a cluster of pawn tickets, and a bare room were all he had to show. End quote. On the afterpains of the crisis of 1866, the following extract from a Tory newspaper. It must not be forgotten that the East End of London, which is here dealt with, is not only the seat of the iron shipbuilding mentioned above, but also of a so-called home industry always underpaid. Quote, "A frightful spectacle was to be seen yesterday in one part of the metropolis. Although the unemployed thousands of the East End did not parade with their black flags en masse, the human torrent was imposing enough. Let us remember what these people suffer. They are dying of hunger. That is the simple and terrible fact. There are 40,000 of them. In our presence, in one quarter of this wonderful metropolis, are packed, next door to the most enormous accumulation of wealth the world ever saw, cheek by jowl with this are 40,000 helpless, starving people. These thousands are now breaking in upon the other quarters. Always half starving, they cry their misery in our ears, they cry to heaven, they tell us from their miserable dwellings that it is impossible for them to find work, and useless for them to beg. The local ratepayers themselves are driven by the parochial charges to the verge of pauperism." End quote. Standard, 5th April 1867. As it is the fashion amongst English capitalists to quote Belgium as the paradise of the labourer, because so-called freedom of labour, or what is the same thing, freedom of capital, is there limited neither by the despotism of trades unions nor by factory acts, a word or two on the so-called happiness of the Belgian labourer. Assuredly, no one was more thoroughly initiated in the mysteries of this happiness than the late M. Ducpétiaux, Inspector General of Belgian Prisons and Charitable Institutions, and member of the Central Commission of Belgian Statistics. Let us take his work Budget économique des classes ouvrières de la Belgique, Brussels, 1855. Here we find, among other matters, a normal Belgian labourer's family, whose yearly income and expenditure he calculates on very exact data, and whose conditions of nourishment are then compared with those of the soldier, sailor, and prisoner. The family "consists of father, mother, and 4 children." Of these 6 persons, "4 may be usefully employed the whole year through." It is assumed that "there is no sick person, nor one incapable of work among them," nor are there "expenses for religious, moral, and intellectual purposes, except a very small sum for church sittings," nor "contributions to savings banks or benefit societies," nor "expenses due to luxury or the result of improvidence." The father and eldest son, however, allow themselves "the use of tobacco," and on Sundays "go to the cabaret," for which a whole 86 centimes a week are reckoned. From a general compilation of wages allowed to the labourers in different trades, it follows that the highest average of daily wage is 1 franc 56 centimes for men, 89 centimes for women, 56 centimes for boys, and 55 centimes for girls. Calculated at this rate, the resources of the family would amount, at the maximum, to 1,068 francs a year. In the family taken as typical we have calculated all possible resources. But in ascribing wages to the mother of the family, we raise the question of the direction of the household. How will its internal economy be cared for? Who will look after the young children? Who will get ready the meals, do the washing and mending? This is the dilemma incessantly presented to the labourers." According to this, the budget of the family is, per year, the father 468 francs, mother 267 francs, boy 168 francs, girl 165 francs, total, per year, 1,068 francs. The annual expenditure of the family would cause a deficit upon the hypothesis that the labourer has the food of the man of war's man, namely 1,828 francs, then a deficit of 760 francs. The food of the soldier, which would be 1,473 francs, leading to a deficit of 405 francs, or the food of the prisoner, amounting to 1,112 francs, leading to a deficit of 44 francs. "We see that few labouring families can reach, we will not say the average of the sailor or soldier, but even that of the prisoner. The general average of the cost of each prisoner in the different prisons during the period 1847 to 1849 has been 63 centimes for all prisons. This figure, compared with that of the daily maintenance of the labourer, shows a difference of 13 centimes. It must be remarked further that if in the prisons it is necessary to set down in the account the expenses of administration and surveillance, on the other hand the prisoners have not to pay for their lodging; that the purchases they make at the canteens are not included in the expenses of maintenance, and that these expenses are greatly lowered in consequence of the large number of persons that make up the establishments, and of contracting for or buying wholesale the food and other things that enter into their consumption. How comes it, however, that the great number, we might say a great majority, of labourers live in a more economical way? It is by adopting expedients, the secret of which only the labourer knows, by reducing his daily rations, by substituting rye bread for wheat, by eating less meat, or even none at all, and the same with butter and condiments, by contenting themselves with 1 or 2 rooms where the family is crammed together, where boys and girls sleep side by side, often on the same pallet, by economy of clothing, washing, decency, by giving up the Sunday diversions, by, in short, resigning themselves to the most painful privations. Once arrived at this extreme limit, the least rise in the price of food, stoppage of work, illness, increases the labourer's distress and determines his complete ruin. Debts accumulate, credit fails, the most necessary clothes and furniture are pawned, and finally the family asks to be enrolled on the list of paupers." Duc Petiot, Loco Citato, pages 151, 154, and 155. In fact, in this paradise of capitalists, there follows, on the smallest change in the price of the most essential means of subsistence, a change in the number of deaths and crimes. See Manifesto of de Maatschappij de Vlamingen vooruit, Brussels, 1860, page 15 and 16. In all Belgium are 930,000 families, of whom, according to the official statistics, 90,000 are wealthy and on the list of voters is 450,000 persons. 390,000 families of the lower middle class in towns and villages, the greater part of them constantly sinking into the proletariat, is 1,950,000 persons, and finally 450,000 working class families is 2,250,000 persons, of whom the model ones enjoy the happiness depicted by Duc Petiot. Of the 450,000 working class families, over 200,000 are on the pauper list. End of Part 7, Chapter 25, Section 5, Part D.